Well, I hope this seminar isn't as depressing as the title perhaps sounds. Um, I don't really want to just bash on the church, but I want to draw out some lessons that I gained from studying the history of the church over many years, but especially last year as I wrote the book Bullies and Saints. Um, my overwhelming impression of church history is that it is mixed. And I think there's a theological undergirding for that. It was Jesus in Matthew 13 who said that amongst his people in the church, there would be both wheat and weeds, and that they would continue together, growing alongside each other right through to the judgment day. And then you think of a letter like 1 Corinthians, and you realize that really from the beginning, even local churches like the house churches of Corinth had some pretty wild things going on. You just read the opening letters, opening chapters of 1 Corinthians, and it's clear that they are having very serious dissension. They were taking each other to court, and there were some pretty serious sexual sins. And yet, the Apostle Paul addresses them throughout as the church, as even Christians that surely need to repent, but nonetheless, he speaks to them to them as if they are real Christians. And so, I think this is true empirically through church history. And I want to just give you some examples, skirting over the top of many others. But my first example is Ambrose of Milan, one of the great pivot figures toward the end of the 4th century. The amazing thing about Ambrose is that he was the first Roman senator, and in fact, he was governor of Milan, who was parachuted into the church as a bishop. This was a first. Normally, bishops had to spend some time as deacons and then priests, and then they would become bishops. And there were all sorts of canon law rulings prior to the time of Ambrose that said you couldn't even be a wealthy person and go into the church as a priest or let alone a bishop. Anyway, so Ambrose of Milan becomes a bishop, and he is a saint and a bully in one. On the one hand, he is fantastic. He is the champion of the poor, and if you had asked a poor family in Milan what you think of Ambrose, they would have said, "Oh, he looks after us. He's set up all these charitable programs and so on." And yet, the same Ambrose acted like a Roman senator in his role as a bishop. He approved of the burning down of synagogues, and when the Emperor Theodosius insisted that the church pay for the rebuilding of the synagogue, Ambrose said, "No way." He flatly contradicted the emperor. In fact, he told the emperor what to do. The emperor was quite a pious man, and Ambrose was quite a bully with him. So you've got this one figure that's sort of really ambiguous. My next example is Charlemagne, the Charles the Great, in the late 8th and early 9th century. The thing about Charlemagne is that, ostensibly he looks like a really pious king. He certainly proclaims Jesus as Lord and is very committed to the advancement of the church. He also sought to convert the pagans, especially in Northern Europe, like the Saxons, at the end of a sword. He literally conducted a jihad where he offered them either baptism, that is conversion to Christianity as he understood it, or the sword. That was the deal. And he slaughtered thousands of Saxons and others in his attempt to expand Christendom. At the same time, there is another character that hardly anyone knows, but he was a huge figure in this same period. His name is Alcuin of York. Alcuin was one of Charlemagne's advisors, and he was the great scholar and deacon who inspired a Europe-wide Renaissance in the late 8th century rather, and also contradicted Charlemagne. He was known as the only man who could. And we have a couple of letters from Alcuin to Charlemagne, begging him to approach the conversion of others through simple, gentle teaching, not through the harsh means of the sword and other sort of taxation policies that forced people to convert. Here's a snapshot of one of Alcuin's letters. Now, to Charlemagne, now in your wise and godly concern, may you provide good preachers for the new people, that is, like the Saxons and other peoples, sound in conduct, learned in the faith and full of the teaching of the gospel, intent on following the example of the apostles in the preaching of the word of God. For they gave their hearers milk, that is, gentle teaching. New converts to the faith must be fed on gentler teaching as babies on milk, lest minds too weak for harder teaching vomit what they have imbibed. Careful thought must also be given to the right method of preaching and baptizing, that the washing of the body in baptism be not made useless by lack in the soul of an understanding of the faith. Which certainly Charlemagne's converts were in that position. Teachers of the faith ought to follow the examples of the apostles. Let them be preachers, not plunderers. My next example comes from several centuries later and is the great Martin Luther. Now, of course, Martin Luther is a brilliant figure in Reformation history. He pretty much recovers the ancient Augustan and Pauline doctrine of justification by grace through faith. He overturns the Catholic teaching of indulgences and so on. And so there's a lot to love about Martin Luther. But Martin Luther was also incredibly judgmental about the Jewish people. And in his book, The Jews and Their Lies, from 1543, so it's mature Luther, he writes the most scathing things about European Jews that border on, well, they more than border on, anti-Semitism. The whole book insults Jews en masse for their corruption, their willingness to poison Christians, and so on. And then he ends with 7 disgusting policy recommendations about what to do with Jews in Europe. And I'm ashamed to even read this, but I must. First, he said, to set fire to their synagogues and schools. And he goes on then to explain how. Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed. And he goes on. Third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing and blasphemy are taught be taken from them. Fourth, I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for the Jews, for they have no business in the countryside, since they are not lords, officials, tradesmen, or the like. Let them stay at home. Sixth, I advise that usury be prohibited to them, and that all cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them and put aside for safekeeping. Seventh, I recommend putting a flail, an axe, a hoe, a spade, a distaff, or a spindle into the hands of young, strong Jews and Jewesses, and letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow. I mean, I hardly know what to do with that one. But my point is that the church is mixed, sometimes in the same character. And of course, the same is true today. This is not just ancient and medieval history. The same is true today. Some of the most beautiful evidence of church goodness is now available because there are social scientists and political scientists who are analysing the social impact of the church. And one of them is this man, Andrew Leigh, who is an atheist, a Labor MP, but is also a world authority on social capital. And he wrote this in his book, Disconnected, about churchgoers. Among churchgoers, 25% also participated in a community service or civic association over the same period. By contrast, among non-churchgoers, just 12% participated in a community or civic association. Regular churchgoers are 16 percentage points more likely to have been involved in a voluntary activity and 22 percentage points more likely to have helped the needy. Those who attend church regularly are more likely to say that they can count among their friends a business owner, a manual worker, or a welfare recipient. Few other institutions are as effective in fostering this bridging social capital between rich and poor. So there's a wonderful story to tell that even secular scholars are unpacking about the impact of the church on our communities, on the poor, on philanthropy, and so on. And yet, we live in one of the darkest periods of church history right now, in the terrible child sexual abuse and cover-ups that the Royal Commission has unpacked for us in excruciating detail. Here's just some of the facts of that Royal Commission. The Royal Commission found that 41.6% of survivors of institutional child sexual abuse were molested in out-of-home care, that is, orphanages, foster care, and so on. 31.8% of survivors of institutional child sexual abuse were molested in schools, and 14.5% of survivors of institutional child sexual abuse were molested in what the Commission categorises as religious activities, that is, churches, Sunday schools, and youth groups. That proportion, 14.5%, is roughly equivalent to the proportion in youth detention centres, 8%, and recreation, sports, and clubs, 5.9%, combined. However, many out-of-home care programs and schools are governed by religious bodies, so it's even worse. The Commission has calculated that 58.6% of survivors of child sexual abuse were molested in one of 1,691 different religious institutions named. Religious bodies, in other words, are responsible for a majority of child sexual abuse in an institution. I think it is arguable that the darkest period of church history isn't the Crusades in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, isn't the Inquisitions in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. It's now. It's the late 20th, early 21st century. And the scandal that will be looked back on in the future, the way we look back on the Crusades. So here is my first lesson, my first of 4 lessons about church history. We should be quick to admit fault. We are not the ones who pretend that we're good through and through. Christians should be the first to admit that we have a log in our eye. And this was Jesus' own teaching, of course. He was the one who said, why do you look at the speck in your neighbour's eye and do not notice the log in your own eye? This is to his disciples. And how can you say to your neighbour, let me take the speck out of your own eye, while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of a neighbour's eye. My point is that we should be quick to admit fault, because church history and the church today is a mix of humility and pride, of peace and violence, and much more. None of which is to deny the spectacular good that the church has done. And as I move to my second lesson, I want to draw this out in a particular way. There are so many wonderful examples of Christian good behaviour that I could draw your attention to. I hardly know where to start. But I do want to talk about the Cappadocian Fathers. Those of you who have done some theology will recognise both of these men, brothers, in fact, literal brothers. Basil of Caesarea in the late 4th century, and his slightly younger brother, Gregory of Nyssa. They both rose to be leading defenders of Trinitarian theology. Those of you who have done theology will have come across the Cappadocian Fathers as the sort of most intellectually satisfying writers on the doctrine of the Trinity. They were leading intellects in the ancient world. But the interesting thing is that they weren't just preachers and theologians and intellectuals. They were absolutely committed to the good of their society. And although not as famous today for these things, in their day they were incredibly well known for wonderful social deeds. Take Basil, for example. Basil established what we think was the first public hospital in world history. Basil's idea, what he called his poorhouse, employed live-in medical staff who cared for the sick, drawing on the best traditions of secular Greek medicine. The healthcare centre, and there's no other way to describe it, included 6 separate departments. It was a small city, one eyewitness describes it as. There was one department for the poor, another for the homeless and strangers, a house for orphans and foundlings. The church in the 4th century was still collecting exposed infants. A completely separate section for lepers, rooms for the aged and infirm, and a hospital proper for the sick. This is the late 4th century, and this was such a success, free public medicine for all, that by the very end of the 4th century, you've got another hospital in Rome. And then as the church moves west, you start to have them throughout Gaul in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. And then throughout Europe by the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, literally thousands of public hospitals, all started because of Basil. His brother Gregory, although the greatest intellect of that century, perhaps in the church anyway, was also the first full-blown abolitionist, and preached with such passion and eloquence against slavery as an institution. Now, of course, it's sad the church didn't do more until much later, but there were great pockets of the abolition spirit in the early church. Gregory wrote these words, or preached these words: "You condemn man to slavery when his nature is free and possesses free will, and you legislate in competition with God, overturning his law for the human species, the one made on the specific terms that he should be the owner of the earth and appointed to government by the Creator. Him you bring under the yoke of slavery, as though defying and fighting against the divine decree. For what price, tell me? What did you find in existence worth as much as this human nature? What price did you put on rationality? How many obols coins did you reckon the equivalent of the likeness of God? How many staters, more expensive coins, did you get for selling the being shaped by God? God said, 'Let us make man in our own image and likeness.' Whenever a human being is for sale, therefore, nothing less than the owner of the earth is led into the sale room. But has the scrap of paper and the written contract and the counting out of obols deceived you into thinking yourself the master of the image of God? What folly!" Powerful stuff. My other example is Augustine, Saint Augustine. Now, most people will know Saint Augustine for his theology. He is perhaps the most influential thinker for 1,000 years. He was the author of over 5 million words. Okay, just soak that up. That's the equivalent of 50 PhDs. But he was also passionate about care, about justice, about freeing slaves and caring for the poor. We have remarkable evidence of this.
One of the typical bits of the stories of the saints and the great figures of 4th and 5th centuries, when they have a religious conversion or when they decide they need to be more serious as Christians, they free their slaves. It's as if that's one of the things you do if you want to show you're serious. You set your slaves free.
By the 5th century, Christians began to confront slavery head-on.
St. Augustine was one of the most important figures of the early church. He was a sometime resident of Rome and also the bishop of the port town of Hippo over the horizon. He's mainly remembered as a towering intellectual, but he was also involved in practical efforts to fight the slave trade that crisscrossed these waters.
In AD 428, in a letter to a church colleague, Augustine tells of the horror of the ancient slave trade and of church efforts to thwart it.
About 4 months prior to my writing this, there were brought in people assembled from various regions, and especially Numidia, by the Galatian dealers, for they either monopolise the trade or apply themselves to it with special relish, with a view to their being shipped out through the port of Hippo. There was not lacking a believer, aware of our custom in acts of mercy of this kind, who reported it to the church. Immediately, 120 people were liberated by our members. Hardly anyone could keep back tears on hearing the different stories about how they were kidnapped or press-ganged before being handed over to the Galatian slavers.
It sounds noble now, but at the time, to their Greek and Roman neighbours, this Christian behaviour seemed odd and wasteful.
It's sadly true that Christians didn't overthrow the scourge of slavery for many more centuries. It's equally true that in ancient times, they were the only ones doing something practical to subvert it. So daring for the church to go and bust out these slaves and secret them away as best they could. In one of Augustine's letters, he says that this practice of freeing slaves was almost bankrupting his diocese. That's how committed they were to it. But let me then draw out my second lesson from all of this. There should be no bifurcation in theological conviction and practical care for the world. Let me read that again. There should be no bifurcation, splitting apart, of theological conviction and practical care for the world. I mean, often the church is one or other, right? You find Christians who are super brainiac theologians, great preachers, you know, they're little Gregories of Nyssa. And then other times, you know, different Christians are passionate for the poor, you know, committed to anti-slavery projects and so on. And sadly, these things are bifurcated. But one of the key lessons that I think we can learn from church history is that in its best moments, the church was able to hold all of this together, to be absolutely committed to sound doctrine and absolutely committed to the work of justice in the world. My third lesson has to do with compromise. You know, one of the genuine puzzles of church history is how the church of the crucified servant king could end up committed to holy war, as they certainly were by the late 11th century, and they crusade for the next 200 or 300 years. The church that started out with the Lord on his knees washing his disciples' feet and giving his life for others ended up killing people in Christ's name and thinking that you could atone for sins through killing the Muslim, the pagan. You know, it's really hard to work out how that could possibly happen. And there are sort of local explanations, local social and political explanations that are acceptable and true. The most obvious is Islamic expansion. This is sometimes where people leave their analysis of the Crusades, just that the Crusades were a response to Islamic violence. And that's true. I mean, a few years after Muhammad's death, his armies defeated the Eastern Roman Byzantine army on the Golan Heights in 636. They moved south, taking Jerusalem and Palestine in 637, and all of Egypt in 642. Then they marched west across North Africa. Islamic forces took Carthage, one of the great cities of the ancient world, in 698, and then Visigoth regions of Spain in 711, and then through the 9th and 10th centuries, they continued to knock on the door of the remains of the Byzantine Empire, what we call Turkey. And yes, the Crusades were a response to all of that, but there's much more that led the church to this point where they could endorse violence as a sacred act for their own salvation. And the way I understand it is that Christianity is susceptible to compromise with its host culture. There is something intrinsic to Christianity that is beautiful, but also a key vulnerability. Christianity, as a missionary religion, isn't tied to any particular language, custom, way of dress, or location. It is sort of transcultural, and that's allows it to be the missionary religion that Christianity always has been. But this ability to be flexible, to acclimatize to a culture, means that we are also susceptible to acquiescing to culture on moral grounds. And this happened really quickly in church history. As the church tried to convert new regions, it adopted the patterns of those new regions and ended up getting converted itself. One example that maybe is less known nowadays, but was a dramatic turning point, is Clovis I. He is the great king of the Merovingian kingdom. This is one of the sort of southern European kingdoms that we know of, the Merovingian, then the Carolingian under Charlemagne. But this Merovingian kingdom ruled a vast part of Europe, southern Europe at least. And Clovis I is the first of these kings to convert. He's baptized in around the year 500. And he went on conquering lands and taking over pagan regions in the name of Christ. And the really interesting thing is we have the letters of bishops to Clovis in this very period, where there's a lot of sucking up. There's a lot of praising of Clovis for his qualities, even though he was renowned to be absolutely brutal, ruthless. But also trying to inject themselves and their missions into his war parties. One interesting letter is from Bishop Avitus, and he wrote a number of letters to the king, but the bishop praises King Clovis for his recent baptism, his successes, and his justice, and adds these words: "There is one matter I would have improved. Through your victories, God makes your people completely his own," that is, brings them into the Christian realm. "Therefore, I would have you extend from your good treasury, the good treasury of your heart, the seed of faith to more remote peoples, to those still situated in a state of natural ignorance," pagans in other words. "Be not ashamed or reluctant to send embassies on the matter, and to add to the realm of God, who raised up your realm to such an extent." We see this in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries, Christians trying to get in with the warrior elites. This is an issue raised by Christopher Tyerman, perhaps the greatest English-speaking Crusade scholar in the world today. He is, in fact, the professor of Crusades at Oxford University. And he outlines a number of the factors that led to the Crusades and lists this very thing I'm trying to get across, that churches were trying to appeal to the pagan warrior elite, and in doing so actually described Christianity, Jesus himself, in the terms of warrior elite culture.
You see in early medieval texts popularizing Christianity that Christ and his apostles, Christ becomes a knight, the apostles become his war band. So the way in which Christianity accommodates the dominant political and social culture of the warrior class is absolutely central to the way in which religious violence becomes an accepted norm.
My point is that in seeking to convert culture, the church was often itself converted. So that by the 11th century, when the call went out to help the Byzantine Empire defeat the Muslims, the church was already in a warrior mindset, thinking that violence could actually be a sacred task, even an atoning task. And so here is my third lesson of church history. Missionary accommodation to society can easily become moral compromise with culture. Missionary accommodation to society can easily become moral compromise with culture. I mean, this reminds me of the Apostle Paul's words, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. We are not to be conformed to the world. Yes, we are a missionary religion. Yes, we are to become all things to all people so that we might win some. Okay, that's the apostles' mentality, but never at the expense of our own principles. And I think you could find plenty of examples today of the church trying to enculturate with society, and in so doing compromising its own gospel principles. As the Apostle Paul put it, we are not to be conformed to the pattern of this world. I must say that this conforming to the pattern of the world was less of a problem in the early centuries of Christianity. And I want to move to my fourth lesson, which has to do with our proper stance toward a world, particularly a world that is pressuring us to be conformed to it. The early Christians seemed to me to be extremely gracious losers. They took so much and replied with grace and kindness, willingly suffering for the sake of the gospel. Persecution in the first 3 centuries of Christianity was real. Now, it's true, it's sometimes exaggerated. And I think Christians have sometimes exaggerated how persecuted the Christians were. I mean, it certainly wasn't for all 300 years until Constantine. There were probably 5 or 6 periods of dramatic persecution in that 200 or 300 year period. The first state persecution is in the year 64, during the Apostle Paul's period. And this is under Nero, who persecuted the Christians of Rome, attacked them. And we have Tacitus, the great Roman historian, to describe this for us. The Christians were covered with wild beasts' skins and torn to death by dogs. They were fastened on crosses, and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. Disgusting stuff. There was another great persecution in the year 112, right across Asia Minor, or what we now call Turkey. We have evidence from Pliny the Younger for this. He writes to Emperor Trajan about his practice of interviewing and killing Christians, and he writes these words: I dismissed any who denied that they were Christians when they had repeated after me a formula calling upon our gods and made offerings of wine and incense to your statue, and furthermore had reviled the name of Christ. None of which things I understand any genuine Christian can be induced to do. I ask them in person if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and third time with a warning of the punishments awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. For whatever the nature of their admission, I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. Christians put up with so much, and their response was to turn the other cheek, to love enemies, and to speak with grace.
Within a generation, Christianity spread to Rome. And in the year 64, the first state-sponsored persecution of the church tested the resolve of Christ's followers to maintain their ethic of love. The Roman writer Tacitus records the brutality of Emperor Nero.
Nero punished the Christians with the utmost refinements of cruelty. Vast numbers were convicted. They were covered with the skins of wild beasts and torn to death by wild dogs. Or they were fastened to crosses, and when daylight failed, they were burned to serve as lamps by night. Nero had offered his gardens for the spectacle and gave an exhibition in his circus.
It's hard to imagine now, but this is where it happened. Nero's great circus or arena ran straight down here with a massive stadium over there. The crowds watched on as countless numbers of Christians turned the other cheek and loved their enemies all the way to their deaths. One leader, himself soon to be martyred in Rome, wrote to the church.
In response to their anger, be gentle. In response to their boasts, be humble. And in response to their cruelty, be civilized. Do not be eager to imitate them. Let us show by our gracious forbearance that we are their brothers and sisters. Let us be eager to be imitators of the Lord.
I've known and taught about this event for years, but to actually stand here is quite confronting. I wonder, could I have done what those Christians did?
Well, I don't know if I could do the same as those Christians. But what was the key to this Christian demeanour of grace, of humility and willingness to suffer in the face of great pressure? Friedrich Nietzsche used to think that the reason the Christians were like that is because they had a slave mentality. They were all lower class citizens. There were many slaves amongst them. And so what does a slave do? It's like a beaten dog. It's just submissive. That was his historical explanation. But I don't think that's at all the case. The evidence that we have actually indicates they had a victor's mentality, not a slave mentality. They were able to be like that because they knew they had already won. And I could give so many examples of the evidence that we have for this mentality, because we have the writings of the Christians through those persecution periods. But one really good one is Tertullian. Tertullian was a lawyer who converted to Christ and used his considerable intellectual and rhetorical skill to defend Christianity. He was a very prominent intellect in Carthage, the great city in North Africa. And a persecution broke out where Scapula, the governor of Carthage, started to harass and then kill Christians. And Tertullian wrote him a 4-page letter. And we have that 4-page letter, and it gives us an insight into the ancient Christian mentality. And it wasn't a slave mentality. Have a listen just to this snippet from the opening page. We are neither dismayed nor greatly disturbed at the persecutions which we suffer from ignorant men. Now, remember, this is written to Governor Scapula. Since we joined this way of life with the understanding that we pledged ourselves to enter into the present conflicts at the risk even of our own lives. We have therefore presented this petition to you, not fearing for ourselves, but for you and for all our enemies. For we are commanded by the teachings of our religion to love even our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. We then, who are saddened by your ignorance, have compassion on human error. We worship one God, whom you all know, since nature is your teacher, at whose lightning and thunder you tremble, at whose benefits you rejoice. The rest you yourselves think to be gods, but we know to be demons. So, even if you compel us to sacrifice to your gods, you will render no service to your gods, because they don't exist. They were incredibly good losers, these first Christians, under immense pressure. Why? Because they knew they had already won. They knew Jesus Christ had been crucified. They knew he'd been raised to life. He'd been vindicated. He sits at God's right hand. He will return to judge the earth. And it's this conviction, this confidence, that actually led to their incredible grace and humility, even in the midst of incredible pressure. And here then is my fourth and final lesson. The key to grace under pressure is confidence that Christ is already Lord. The key to grace under pressure is confidence that Christ is already Lord. And of course, we find this in the writings of the apostles. For example, 1 Peter 3:15 says, "Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord." In other words, don't fear that mob, those who are persecuting you. Fear the Lord. He is the true Lord. And then it says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. I love this because it's the confidence that Christ is Lord that leads to an ability to show gentleness and respect to a world that wants to persecute you. There is much more I could say about this, but our time is short. So let me just summarize my 4 lessons of church history for you. First lesson, we should be quick to admit fault. We haven't been all that we should be. We should admit the log in our eye. Second lesson, there should be no bifurcation of theological conviction and practical care for the world. Third, missionary accommodation to society can easily become moral compromise with culture. Lord, deliver us. And fourth, the key to grace under pressure is confidence that Christ is already Lord. Well, may we learn from both the bullies and the saints of church history, and may we be those who are so confident in Jesus Christ that we just refuse to compromise, that we are quick to admit our fault, that we reach out to the world with a humility and a gentleness that commends the gospel.